Hi everyone, welcome. I'm James Harding, and I think you probably know that. It's the open news meeting, so either Tortoise members or colleagues from Tortoise are here. We're going to talk about variants, and we're going to talk about Aung San Suu Kyi and Myanmar, and we're going to talk about anything else that you think we should be talking about. I'm aware that January 2021 felt for many people like the longest month in what already felt like the beginnings of a long year. So we start February with an awareness of some news fatigue and an even keener awareness that some stories are getting missed. So in that spirit, please do weigh in with thoughts that you've got of things that we should be covering. But I'm going to start, if I might. I'm hoping that Matt's here. Matt, Dancona, have you joined us? Because I wanted to get a sense from you, if you're there. Just on Matt, I tell you why I wanted to start with variants, was I actually wanted to start with the Time story this morning and Sage, because we keep seeming to see the same story, which is Sage says something in government, a few weeks later it turns out it's in the papers. And I know you've had a look at independent Sage, which gathered quite a lot of interest early on in this.
Yeah.
And just what you think about the relationship between Sage and government and what it's telling us about the new variants.
Yes, thanks, James. Well, it's depressing in the middle of the sort of relatively good news about vaccine rollout to find the recurrence of a familiar pattern from last year, which is that Sage sends a flare up about a particular problem in the pandemic, and there seems to be no significant political response, and it's taken until now by which point there are 105 cases, I think, already of variant E4 or 84K, the South African mutation in this country, for there to be a response to it, which is that in certain postcodes, people are going to be advised to sort of go into super lockdown and to raid their cupboards for food and not go outdoors at all, which is really, close to house arrest. So this matters because the vaccine rollout is not just, has two purposes. The first, of course, is to try and stop or totally minimize the death rate. So that's why the most vulnerable are being prioritized. But its second and second most important purpose is to shorten the time in which the virus has to mutate, because the longer that it is abroad and about and doing its work in the community, the more opportunities it has to mutate. And the significance of the South African variant is that we don't know yet whether the vaccines work with it. And that in itself is obviously alarming, because it suggests that the virus may be learning how to burrow its way through what the vaccine does. So it's a very significant institutional failure, this. And I think that after the pandemic, there's going to have to be a real overhaul of the relationship between scientific advisory groups and the government, because Sage has proved, Sage is not blameless in this. It's quite a discordant group. It's been far too public. Far too many members of Sage have gone freelancing on media and not presented a united front. But government has also been quite tardy in taking advice on things like this, where clearly this was one to err on the side of caution. And I must confess, I'm baffled by this one, because it was so obviously the case that the South African variant was going to arrive here, and that it was a more aggressive mutation even than the Kentish one.
And Matt, there are two things that my suspicious mind alights on. One is the blaming of the variants for, and particularly the Kent variant, for the big increase in infection rates and as a result death rates in the UK. How fair is that? How responsible do you think it is the case that it is one variant that has really been responsible for this? Are there a multitude of variants, you say? And secondly, the thing I still don't understand is why this became clear only in government circles as late as the 18th of December, if they were beginning to track that variant from the 9th of September?
Well, it's a precise analog with the story that's been revealed today, which is in that case an even greater delay between the warning of the variant to come and then the surge. I think it's true that there is reasonable clinical evidence about the greater transmissibility of the Kentish variant. But I share your suspicious mind on the fact that clearly there were other factors at work. Are other factors at work in the current surge, not least the failure of the tiered system and the relaxation of the rules over Christmas. I think have had a big effect. But what's striking is that it took such a long time for ministers to get their heads around what is actually a very familiar feature of epidemiology, which is that viruses mutate and often mutate into more aggressive forms. This should have been, as they were planning, front and foremost of as they were thinking particularly about vaccine rollout, is we need to get this done quickly, not just to reduce deaths, but also to press down on the virus so that it stops morphing into more dangerous forms.
Okay, and Matt, thank you. Tess, Murray, I'm just intrigued. We talked a little bit this morning about variant versus vaccine. I'm just interested to know how, like, what you think we should do. Is there a way of doing this story-wise that we should pursue?
Look, I mean, it's becoming a sort of bit of a hackneyed cliche, isn't it? No one's safe till we're all safe. I just lose sight somehow, so I think there are just two ways of looking at this. One is how we have reacted to variants and the decisions we should have taken about closing borders, about locking down harder once we'd spotted these variants coming through. And everyone knows viruses mutate. My second worry is that until we, when you've seen the WHO sort of devalued consistently through this process by big forces, how we're going to just not end up playing a really, really, really long game of whack-a-mole around the globe with the virus, unless we have a properly amped up global vaccination rollout. And I just linked to, I know the one campaign is, one of the organization, the kind of global lobbying and platform are trying to track the vaccine readiness test country by country. And I just worry that we aren't attacking this from both ends, from a kind of local and global level. How we report that gets back into a wider take on the kind of EU debate of the last week, doesn't it? Which is how do you manage your own hierarchy and supply against the global context? And who's going to forgive you for donating your part of your supply to somebody whose life is not relevant to yours?
I think you're right. You'll see that Andrew Girdwood says, I like, we're not safe until we're all safe. I'm going to come to Judith Smith in a moment just about the preconditions, which are the areas. But Chris Cook, can I just come to you first? What do you think on this?
So I think it's I think we're obviously I was looking at the prediction markets actually this morning on one of the good prediction markets, Metaculus, has a 50% chance that there'll be a variant development that will allow the reinfection of people. So the prediction that there'll be a new variant that will emerge that will allow reinfection, that will reinfect or infect 10 million people, right? So that's quite a scary prospect. That is a variant emerging that potentially nullifies some of the effect, at least, of the vaccination process and sets us back, if you like, a few months. They put that at 51% at the moment. It's important to remember that the variants emerge under antibody pressure, and there's some new research on antibody pressure, which is to say the variants that are emerging are not ones that are more susceptible to being wiped out by our immune systems, they're ones that are less susceptible to being wiped out by immune systems. And as we inoculate more people, it will be a harder environment for the virus to live in. So the evolutionary pressure will be to more frightening variants that can evade. They may be less dangerous, and they may be less able to actually cause death, but they will be better able to escape immunological pressure. So it's quite a scary point at the time. We should expect, I think, to start seeing more variation, not least because more countries are now doing the screening. Actually, for a long time, Britain has been the sort of superpower on variants. So it might all get quite frightening for the next few months, but we kind of should have expected this, and we've actually got to quite a good place where we can if it comes to it, we can vaccinate everyone on the current vaccines and then redevelop new vaccines and do it again next year. And that's sort of the path to normality. So I think we shouldn't get freaked out by it. It's a different world to be emerging when you're trying to stamp out a subtype of the coronavirus. That's the better place to be than trying to stamp out the main one, which has got much wider prevalence. And we've got the kit in place now, like we know how to do it. So I think we should be sanguine about it.
Okay, that's quite a hard ask, Chris. The first half of the answer was, by the way, there are real risks that there's going to be development of a variant that wipes out the efficacy of the vaccine. And the second half was a plea to be sanguine. I definitely.
I think people have to. I think we have to be realistic about the fact that it's been. It will be a lot. It'll be like a long tail of. There'll be a long tail of stuff to sort of clean up and sort of sort out. But actually, once we should, if we manage this properly, we should be able to get to a place where the vaccination against the main strains make the coronavirus quite a rare disease. Like we reduce its prevalence, in particular in Western countries, and then it becomes a game of sorting out countries where the vaccine hasn't reached, right? Particularly in the Southern Hemisphere before their winter, and it becomes like a whack-a-mole thing of like, okay, so there's a new variant that's emerging, let's get ahead of it with a vaccine, and it becomes like the flu basically.
So can I ask you? So when you're going to laugh at me and think how naive I am. When the pandemic started, I thought it would be the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, right? And now,
can I point out, you should have read my emails to you about this.
I did. I read them and still thought that, Chris, because of my sunny disposition and delusional optimism problems. Is it the case that you think if you were writing, Chris, like you're writing in 2040 the history of the world, what the chapter that runs COVID-19 pandemic runs from what year to when, do you think?
2023, something like that. So we have an acute problem now, right? Don't we? So we've got a, hang on, Jennifer, give me a second, right? So I think we're going to have a first phase, which is, if you like, about rolling out the vaccination against the if you like, the main variant, and then we're going to move into management of new variants as they arrive. And it's possible to screw up the sequencing such that we will basically be vaccinating against the wrong disease by the end of this year. Right? Like, it's possible for this all to go catastrophically wrong. But I think we're in the rollout's pretty fast. Like, it's pretty remarkable, and the danger is all around variation emerging in and the incubation of new variants in the developing world in particular, who remember, most of whom have winter to come.
Yeah. Okay, good. I just want to point out, Chris, that Fliss's oncologist, who is in a related field, we're journalists, he's an oncologist, is in a related field, was also optimistic, so we shared the same, character flaws.
My thing was there will not be another in-person event from March to July 2021 was my bet.
Oh yes, that's right, you did say that. Yeah, you did. All right, so can I just bring in Judith Smith? And I want to come to Kirsty Lang, because my worry about Kirsty's comment is that she's come up with an either or, and it's probably both. Judith, are you there? I just want to hear.
Hi, yeah.
Hey there.
Thank you.
So what's the point?
I suppose my point is slightly more at an angle really to what's been discussed, is that we can look at variants as much as we like, but what are the preconditions that are allowing the virus to exist and continue to exist and, you know, go through its various stages of change? And I wonder if we've had enough focus on that. Yes, of course, we've talked about people who have been dying from the illness, the socio-economic conditions, but, you know, perhaps there are other issues we ought to be maybe critiquing a little bit more, but also putting the resources in to address those issues before the next variant comes along. And it'll be a longer term project, I understand that. But for example, you know, there is a sure fact that the NHS was not ready for this because it was so underfunded and under-resourced. And, you know, there are areas now of the country where people are getting the virus when they're in hospital, for example. Now, why is that? It's because there's undertrained staff, there's not enough staff. And, you know, that's how the illness is spreading in some respects. Now, there needs to be a focus on those areas where that's happening, I think. You know, I mean, obviously somewhere like East London is a classic. I mean, I did some work there about 3 years ago. There was 20,000 nurses short in that area. This is inevitable that we're going to have, you know, the continuing issues. But I also think there are other things at work, at play in that case. For example, employment, where people are employed, how is it spread within the general population due to work? So there are lots of other facets.
Julie, can I just put one thing to you, which is just, here I'm just repeating what I heard a week or so ago at our health summit. Sally Warren, who runs policy at the King's Fund and who did a lot of work on NHS policy, social care policy at the Department of Health and elsewhere in government. Her point is that we fixate on the NHS and resources for the NHS, but actually the NHS itself is only responsible for 20% of health outcomes. The vast majority of what happens in health is actually around housing, socioeconomics, air quality, all the rest of that. And just so you know, when I saw your comment in the chat, the thing that it made me think was, we still don't really understand fully why you're getting such a high incidence of infections in Essex, or why you're getting variants that are emerging in Kent or Manaus or parts of South Africa. Maybe people actually on the call do understand it and can point to some of the reasons, but presumably that is a really fundamental issue. If we're going to keep on getting variants, we've got to see what are the conditions in which those variants thrive.
Yes, I feel quite strongly about that. I think if we look at everyone, you know, in the past about how we've addressed disease, we know in this country, for example, things have improved in terms of our public health because of the nature of the way we address that. And actually, over the last 20 years, we've started moving back into overcrowded housing, for example. You know, even if you've got the best spanking, you know, high rise, they're very tiny areas, there are a lack of fresh air and open air, you know, and these are all the things that address things like TB and other infectious diseases, and we've forgotten about that. And so public health is the area where we should be focusing. I really feel strongly about that.
Yeah, and you know, and I also think there's a kind of mea culpa. Other of my colleagues might disagree, but I think there's a mea culpa in journalism, which is that, you know, if you think about health journalism, public health was always the sort of most wonkish, least interesting and exciting one in terms of stories. It was always innovations, extraordinary tales of heroism and drama, yes. You know, and now we're really focused on public health. I'm going to come, I might to Kirsty. Thanks, Judy.
Yeah,
Kirsty, what was your point on it was global coordination and closed borders, right?
Well, I suppose what I was trying to say is that I think our government naively believes that if we vaccinate everybody within our borders, we can somehow beat this. And I don't think we can. So we either take part in a global response, or the only other alternative is to go down the road of an Australia or a New Zealand and you close off all your borders. But and okay, maybe that works for a bit, but there's no exit strategy and it's kind of disastrous long term for your economy. So, I mean, my view is that you have to go down the global response route. And I mean, you mentioned South Africa. I mean, I don't know this, but I suspect that one of the reasons for the South African variant is it's a country in the world that has one of the highest number of people living with HIV and AIDS. So they've got compromised immune systems. And we need to know this stuff, and we need to be helping countries like South Africa. And this is the only way, because otherwise it'll all be all our efforts to vaccinate our population within British borders will be wasted.
So I had a call last week with Henrietta Fore, who's the head of UNICEF, who's been doing they've been trying to do a lot of the coordination, and she's running COVAX, the global coordination on this. I mean, she was pretty blunt that there is a really big timing problem here, in that you have essentially most of the vaccine production will be in the second half of the year. Obviously, the bulk of demand is now, and the rich countries of the world will get the vaccine, and the 85 poorest won't get the vaccine, and you will get A, the variants, and then B, the closures. So, I mean, I was really interested, even someone who's at the heart of that UN agency network finds it really hard to see how you mandate countries, because you have to mandate the countries not only on the production and distribution of vaccine, and we've seen how that's gone in the EU, but there are all these ancillary products that have to be distributed fairly, and you have to have fairness through the supply chains and ports. And I don't know, Kirsty, whether we're just sort of being unrealistic to hope for that. It's just not going to happen.
Well, I didn't know till the other day that India is one of the largest producers of vaccines in the world, and I was quite struck actually by how it's the Indian government who have now said they're going to be supplying AstraZeneca vaccines to South Africa. Look, I'm not an expert on this, but I think that it is, just after, as we did after the global financial crisis, gathered people, the heads of state around the table and said, we can only sort this out if we act together globally. I think we have to do that. I think the moment has come. And I mean, the hope is that the Biden White House will lead some kind of initiative like that. Otherwise, I can't really see a way out.
Yeah. I mean, curiously, G7 conferences, summits are always overhyped and less than they tend to be. But actually, you could, this one in Cornwall, try and make some progress on that front. I just want to come to Nico, and I'm going to come to Claire Montague as well in a moment, if I might, Claire. But Nico, can I just, the question you raise is actually comes from the other end, is what's our tolerance? If I read it right, Nico, it's like, what are we prepared to live with? Is that your point?
Yeah, it's, I mean, at one level, it's an existential thing. That I observe that we're not prepared to make any sacrifices or I mean, obviously we are making sacrifices, but we're not prepared to take any risk for anything. And it seems to me that historically our societies have been prepared to take huge risks. Obviously, wartime, people volunteering to fight and so on. People accepting that their children will die or they may die for a greater cause and so on. But we now seem to be, no politician these days will just say, this is, well, Johnson sort of said it at the start, said, there will be a certain amount of deaths and we've got to accept that. But we really won't do that anymore. And the reality is that there are, there are very negative externalities to lockdown, and we know all about them and we're learning more about them. But we don't count them and we don't balance them and we don't audit them against, the attempt to try and get to zero COVID. And I take Chris's point in the chat that, we're not going to get there. We just have to try. And I do accept that this is a difficult to control and phenomenon. And, it's not maybe easy to balance in some ways. But yeah, I just think we have an we don't know what a good life is anymore. And when we say, okay, we accept that we lose people and, we can philosophically rationalize that.
I had an interesting conversation with someone last week who works in the government security world, and who said something interesting about counterterrorism versus public health. And what his point was, in counterterrorism, we have a clear idea of what our tolerance level is, right? Which is zero tolerance. there are no acceptable levels of deaths from terrorism, right? The problem is, at the moment, of course, we're not being set an acceptable level of deaths from COVID-19, although the system is being asked that all the time. Within the NHS, you're being asked that all the time, you know, who can you save and who can't you? And more broadly, the kind of economic health equation is also forcing government to ask that question, but there is no place, and I've got some sympathy with politicians on this, there's no easy place that you can have that conversation and say, look, we've weighed it up and in the end, X number of deaths a year or X number of deaths a month is what we're going to have to live with because the knock-on effects are otherwise too great. And I don't know whether you've got a view on how you get through that.
Well, I think it was Chris earlier on said Sage were being too, no, it was Matthew saying Sage was being too open. I don't think government is being open enough with us about the big political issues around this and the policy issues and the, you know, balancing things up and having a conversation with us. And if they did and they treated us like adults rather than people to be bossed around and treated like errant children, then I think we'd be much more tolerant of the sacrifices we're making. And I've just had an email from my dad's care home. You know, we're not going to see him at least until the end of March when the second vaccine comes, but they're not even saying that. And here's the irony is that elderly people in care homes are being locked away from their relatives to save their lives. To save their lives for what? So they can't see their relatives. So, and I think on terrorism, we do accept it. We accepted 22 young people being killed in Manchester because we're too scared to have a discussion about the role of radical Islam and terrorism. So it's just an aside. But I think an honest conversation with us, I think would be much more tolerant about this and would be much more prepared to accept. And also the 100,000 figure, we didn't really discuss this, I don't think. You know, it's such a disingenuous figure we were discussing last week. You know, no one talks about excess deaths anymore.
No, I know.
People do not make the point, and I know that not everyone is run over by a bus within 28 days of getting COVID tests, but how many deaths are not related to COVID? How many people are getting COVID on their death certificate because it's easier to put on if you're a clinician or a mortician or a coroner and so on. So I think, you know, the figure sounds very big and we make it sound very big, and that makes it even more difficult to have the conversation.
Nico, thank you.
Welcome.
I don't know whether Kerry Thomas, my colleague, is here. Kerry, is there a sensible way that we think about this kind of variance? Should you think?
No, I was conscious that we were. I did wonder at the outset whether we were ascribing just a little bit too much uncertainty to Sage. I was just looking at the minutes of the meeting, and when you go through it, they say the emergence of new variants of concern around the world presents a rationale for attempting to reduce importation of even small numbers of infectious cases. This rationale will strengthen if new variants emerge that are capable of immune escape. So I'm not entirely sure that we'd be right to think that Sage is saying to the government, shut the borders now. They're talking about a rationale that will get stronger if variants that are capable of immune escape come along, and we're not in that position yet. So I think we might just want to check how firm that ground is. I mean, I think in the end, for me, the variants, it changes everything, doesn't it? Because you remember conversations that we had a few months ago where I had thought that actually once we got into vaccinations, that we would be treating COVID a bit like we treated winter flu. So we'd effectively separate society into two groups: an A group that were at risk and we needed to keep safe, and a B group where it didn't matter too much if COVID ran riot through them because they weren't going to get that sick anyway. And the truth is, two things I think changed: that long COVID, and then, you know, the variants fundamentally change it. So clearly, I've clearly had to change my mind completely about how and who we vaccinate and the need to keep doing it. But
Kerry, can I ask you one thing? So this is that embarrassing thing. I'm ashamed to say there's a plot line to some of the Bond films that I've always found quite difficult to follow, which is Spectre, right? Like, who are those guys? What are they? And I'm coming to have the same feeling around Sage. I don't actually, the more and more I look into Sage, the less I really understand who it is, how it works, and it's presented to be an authority. You'd be forgiven for thinking, when you read the papers, Sage advised the government this, Sage is researching that. I'm really unclear, you know, who are those guys?
I think we might want to jump back to Matt, because I think Matt probably knows more about Sage than I do. But I mean, Sage is not one thing, even, is it? You know, that Sage has in subgroups that deal with behavioural science, that deal with modelling, and, you know, so we know that there are sort of offshoots of Sage. And I think, you know, you'll have heard the argument from businesses that we need a sort of economic Sage, because businesses have feared that the sort of public health messages from Sage have been taken too literally and ascribed too much clarity, whereas the economic case has been quieter and less clear. So I think, yes, what is Sage? I don't know if Matt is there to sort of fill us in.
Matt,
well,
I mean, do you want to do that?
I think your suspicions are justified. I remember when I was researching one of the files we did on this, a virologist described Sage to me as an underlying condition rather than an organisation. It was a very good line. And I think what he meant was that I think there was a point at which 1,000 scientists could claim with some degree of legitimacy to be a member of Sage. And so, to Kerry's point, it's
how many did you say?
About 1,000. I mean, not now. I think this has been sorted out, but that it is so amorphous, and actually it subdivides, as all such organisations do, into key committees. But the problem that has arisen is twofold. First of all, that to your Spectre point, there's the invocation of Sage gives the impression of 10 or 12 wise people gathered around a table and coming to a very, very clear conclusion. Whereas I think it's more, and Kerry's reading the minutes was fascinating, it's more like a kind of Oxbridge high table where there's a lot of argument and then a kind of meaningless consensus quite often. And then secondly, which is a fault that lies with Cabinet Office and ministers, was there's no real media guidelines. So any member of Sage can go on Newsnight or the Today programme, and naturally a member of the public will see this as the view of Sage. And actually, as in all scientific groups, the main thing, their governing feature is they all disagree with each other.
Okay, well, I'm gonna come to Lucy Huberman, who said something intriguing, but I said I'd come to Claire Montague first. So Claire and then Lucy. Claire, I know we've talked in the past about sort of how you see government in all of this. What do you think?
So I was responding to the conversation about the balance of investment between NHS and public health. And I was a SPAD in the Labour government 10 years ago when there was a great deal more money and I would say this, but willingness to engage with some of the more complex debates around public health. And my experience was just trying to get traction and comms and politicians interested in really difficult public health kind of consequences, and the wonkery is just very, very hard. And politicians and voters point in the same way, which is hospitals and nurses and doctors. And it seems to me that it is, I know Sally Warren well, and while she's absolutely right that most health outcomes are related to matters outside the NHS, I cannot see how you get voters away from the religion that is the NHS institution and the politicians responding to that. And that's the case of, and it's always hospital based as well, you know, hospitals, nurses and doctors. It's not even primary care or allied health professionals. So I think it's a worthy aim, but I think one has to be realistic about the incentives that politicians have and are working with.
There is an interesting thing, I don't know whether you read, Alistair Campbell wrote one of our slow views last week where he took a swing at the BBC. In the last third of it, he also took a swing at Labour. And there is a thing in this, Claire, which I think is probably worth pursuing for us on the politics, which is, where is Labour in these kinds of arguments right now? Because, you know, I heard this argument that we're moving from a world of, you know, national security, 9/11, past cybersecurity, through biosecurity to human security. And there's not a sense that Labour has got, which is an organising idea around what health, public health, social health means now. And maybe I'm being unfair because the noise just doesn't allow for it. But I don't know whether you hear anything that makes you think, okay, there's a way of thinking about this that you're getting now from the left.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's no policy thinking at all in the Labour Party at all. I mean, to be fair to Keir, he's got a kind of problem the size of Wales dealing with his own backyard, and no one listens to the Labour Party either. But I genuinely think that the Labour is also struggling from exactly the same groupthink and also union entrenched views about the workforce as well, and trying to think in a kind of complex, nuanced way about the future of the world and about global challenges away from sort of Whitehall, Westminster rows is really hard when you're in opposition and when you've got no kind of bandwidth or air or anything. And I think Labour is just a bunch of quite inexperienced, like the government is, spokespeople trying to find their way. And I don't get the sense that Keir has got any kind of organising principle at all, other than to be slightly more efficient and more grown up. Well, not slightly more efficient, distinctly more efficient and more grown up than his predecessor, and also to deal with some really quite big issues within the Labour Party itself, which he's been lucky enough to not have too much focus on. And to some extent, that's what oppositions do early on in a term anyway. But I don't think there's thinking coming out of Labour at all, or on the left.
It's just the argument you would make is it's very hard to shift the centre of ground on British politics around healthcare away from NHS and hospitals if it didn't move with Labour, if they weren't involved in that. Judy, I'm just going to go to Lucy. Lucy Hoopman, are you there?
Hi.
We may have lost Lucy. Oh, there you are. Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
Hey there. So can you just talk to us about Sage, rivalries, what you think is going on inside there?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry, I'm not going to get drawn into this discussion about Labour, but I don't think Labour is only about what goes on in Westminster. Sorry. There's quite a lot of interesting thinking, and it doesn't always lie there. But anyway, I'm not going to get drawn into that today. I think Matt knows more about Sage than I do. I just know that if you choose 2 people or 4 people to be the chief medical officer, chief scientific officer, or whatever Jenny Harries is, Jonathan Van Tam, you choose them, and then they come out and they say, we advise, the government decides. I can only imagine what level of discussion, debate, and disagreement goes on to get to the statements that we get, because they're often contradictory. They're not actually all backed up by the latest research papers. And so those people sit on some, I imagine, very uncomfortable line between science and politics. But what I really wanted to say was about public health, because although I'm not, a doctor, I have watched the kind of decimation of public health systems since 2010, 2012. Lansley, I've seen it in, public health posts in universities. I've seen it in strategic health authorities. I've worked through it in innovation projects. And you're right, media doesn't see it as sexy, but it's because there's no money there. It's not where the high-end, high academic research is. It's not where the labs are. It's not where the funding is. It's not where the drugs companies are. It's not where the intrigue is. It is absolutely what they call shoe leather, literally running around knocking on doors, which they're doing now, by the way, with these new tests.
That's true. That's true.
That is public health in action. That is how you wipe out a pandemic. That's how they wiped out smallpox around the world. So it's all gone. But can I just say, on Sage, there was nobody with any public health experience whatsoever at the beginning. None. That is why Sir David King set up Independent Sage, which has provided a lot of nuance, a lot of reports, and frankly, I do know behind the scenes he's advising the government.
Right. Yeah, well, that's probably a good thing, I'd say, Lucy. Listen, I see that Stuart has had his hand up for a while, so Stuart, I don't know whether you wanted to weigh in.
And really,
Hello
Hi,
there.
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well, thanks.
Good. Basically, yeah, the problem the NHS has got is the government's been cutting the resources that they give them for years. And obviously, the pandemic has shown us if nothing else, they are the most important service because, let's face it, no people, no point in having any of the other services. So the
But
NHS is the most important one. Sorry, carry on.
And how much, Stuart, I don't know whether you saw Mark St Andrew, my colleague, was saying, actually, this is really about a frontline issue in the NHS, i.e. nurses and that kind of care. Is that where you think it is? Because the NHS often says it's equipment and cost of medication. Where you see where you physically see the problem with the NHS funding issue to be?
Well, I think there's plenty of people that want to go into caring for people because, let's face it, most of us want to look after each other. But it all does come down to the fact that the government's been restricting their resources for years and years. And they're saying the NHS can't cope, but guess whose fault it is? It's yours. You know,
Right.
the government have been removing resources from the NHS for years and spending it on crap that we don't need, like cycle lanes in London and stuff like that, which obviously they're saying now, oh, that's not legal. You know, well, why did it happen then?
Well, firstly, I've got to say, I'm a fan. I cycle to work, so I'm a fan of the old cycle lane. But I do, and in fact, you probably say to me, Stuart, I should probably use the cycle lanes more. So that's a whole other thinking for another time. But listen, I really do appreciate the point on NHS and NHS funding. I think the thing that we're sort of grappling with here a bit is also how much do we have an NHS problem, which is a real problem, but it crowds out all the other, healthcare problems. I think, Lucy's point about which I love. Listen, I'm going to stop this if I might, because I've done what often happens, which is get overrun by our first subject. I do want to just have 15 minutes, if we might, on anything else. Anyone else who wants to flag something up, we're all ears. But I do want to just talk about Aung San Suu Kyi and Myanmar and the read on that. And I don't know whether or not I was going to start, if I could, Giles, with you. How do we frame, whose side should we be on here? And by the way, who's we?
Yeah, Chris wrestled with this in SenseMaker this morning. Who's doing the deeming here? Who's deeming Aung San Suu Kyi the lesser of two evils? Well, it does seem that we all are. The US administration, for what it's worth, predictably, or at least a nice sort of hark back to pre-Trump era, has come out with a straightforward condemnation of the coup. The will of the people must be heard. And the will of the people is very clear. I think that's whose side we should be on, by the way. I mean, it's complicated, but they overwhelmingly backed Aung San Suu Kyi's party in last November's elections. There's the whole question of the extent to which they also backed, repressive / genocidal policies towards the Rohingya Muslims over the past 5 years. And that's why the question of whose side we should be on within Myanmar arises. But I think an interesting question now is what happens next, and what does China do next? The US has very few levers. It can impose sanctions on companies that do business with the with the Myanmar military, which remains central to the economy. It can sanction individuals, but it's pretty clear that was factored in before the decision to mount this coup was launched. I was just reading. People who've kept a much closer eye on Myanmar than I, or even perhaps you, really saw this coming. There was a meeting between the senior general, whose name I'm going to pronounce phonetically, Hliang, in Myanmar last year with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister. The question, was he tipped off? If so, did he give him the nod? Remains to be answered. But if you now look back in the sort of 48 hours before the coup, there was a lot of pleading with the military not to go ahead with it. It was clearly in the air. And then look at the options for China, which has worked with Aung San Suu Kyi over the past 5 years. But we know that their default response to anything like this is no foreign meddling because of their own concerns, but also faced with a choice between a pliant dictatorship and a potentially rowdy democracy. It's not hard to see why Beijing would rather have the
Generals.
former, and they certainly the Chinese response to this is of much more significance to the putschists
well, that's
than the Americans.
That's interesting. I see Mehdi Ascarius made the point in the chat that there's been no official reaction from China yet.
They have noted the coup. There have been statements from the foreign ministry.
But no, but this was a thing. That's the reason I want to come to Ellen Halliday, if I might, just because we've been trying to think through how we commission slow views. So one of the things that's on our minds is how do you do something that are not snap op-eds, they're not snap, reactionary opinions, but they take a kind of look over time. And Ellen, you were talking about Taiwan in a meeting we had yesterday, and I just wanted to wonder whether you'd thought any further on the kind of whose problem is this question? Taiwan, Alexei Navalny in Russia, Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar. Which capital are we turning to these days to find out whose response matters?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and what we kind of talked about when we discussed it yesterday was, I think the question was sort of, well, who's now, the global police? Is there a global policeman anymore? And I mean, my thought was maybe just that, for a long time, the US saw itself as a global policeman, but in much of, whether it's Taiwan and the South China Sea in that area, it's just that the policeman now is Beijing, and that policeman isn't, protecting democratic principles, isn't protecting rights in the same way. It's more of an authoritarian policing. And I think that it's difficult, and for sure that Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea, is kind of a problem that the rest of the world doesn't have a response to at the moment. That doesn't mean it's not something we shouldn't worry about. These are people's lives, people's freedoms. But I don't think we yet have an answer. We've seen for a long time, the US sort of warning China off action in Taiwan, but it's always been quite close to the line. So who knows what will happen now? But yeah, I think that China's influence in that region is quite challenging to keep in check.
It's a really interesting one, Ellen. By the way, is Ella Hill? Ella, are you here as well on this? I just wondered what you thought, if you are. Where's Ella? I think I just messaged you. Oh, there's your mic. Yeah, hey, Ella.
Hi, how are you?
Hello, very nice you're out. God, that's the right way to do it.
Having a walk and a talk.
Yeah, so did you? So I hope you don't get blown away. What do you think on this? Because the thing, because I know that you've done some of the work for our sense maker on this. Were there things that you thought are ways that we could pursue it that would be interesting?
I think that definitely doing more on the slow views, like Ellen said, it's tough, because I think that partly what we were trying to do with SenseMaker Audio today is just to make sense of what is quite a long story, and a long story coming, because you've got, a country that has a long history of being underneath the military junta, and you've got something quite complicated there. But then also, as Ellen said, you've got, you know, it feeding into geopolitics now. So I don't have a concrete answer necessarily.
The reason why the link for me is between, you know, what Kirsty Lang was saying about how do you get global coordination around vaccines? How do you actually get some kind of sense of international responsibility that's effective on these public health issues, as well as on political and human rights issues? I mean, there's a curious thing, which is, you know, you clearly hear a totally different tone from Tony Blinken, the new US Secretary of State. The question is actually what he'll do. That's the thing I'm not clear on. But Ella, by the way, I feel bad about catching you on a healthy walk. Listen in, and I'm just going to bring in William Jeremy, who's got his hand up. William. Hold on, William. I think you're still muted, so let's just make sure we can hear you.
Oh, am I still muted? Okay.
No, got you. Can we
Mute? Yeah, can you hear me now?
We got you. Yeah.
We're just thinking about whether there's anything to be done on the role of the military generally in what you could call emerging democracies. My understanding is about Aung San Suu Kyi is that her father was a very revered figure in Burmese society and politics and the military as well. And of course, he at first, during the Second World War, backed the Japanese as a way of advancing the nationalist cause. And then, of course, he saw how dreadful a choice that was. And he had a wholesale change of mind about, you know, the potential role of the West, as it were, in development. Then wasn't her father killed in a counter coup or
exactly.
No? And so her psychology around the military itself must be very conflicted.
Yeah.
In
by the way, William, I think this is the really interesting piece, which is, you know, I saw Nimmo, I see your point about, look, we can't just say that she was a bystander, you know, in the persecution of the Rohingya, that she was active in it. What's difficult, I don't know, Nimmo, whether you're there and you want to sort of elaborate on that point. What I think is difficult is how you understand kind of Burmese nationalism and even Buddhist nationalism within the context of Myanmar, which I don't understand, but I can understand how you could be a political prisoner and then step into the stream of that politics once you gain power. Nimmo, are you there? There you are. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here. Well, I have to say that I definitely don't know like a lot about this. I don't know enough. But what I do, from what I do know, is that like I completely understand the point that she was like a political prisoner for 15, 20 years, and she was effectively, you know, she came in and she like came into the spotlight, and she was kind of a champion for democracy at one point. But what has happened in the last few years is that it's not even that she was she was thinking, let me keep the military on side, and so I will look the other way as these things go on. She was an important part of stoking anti-Rohingya sentiment in Myanmar, in order to, because she genuinely believed that they are illegal foreigners in the country and they do not have a right to be there. So I think that it is more than just a political move in order, which is in its own right horrific and, you know, should be condemned, but it is coming from a place of, from what I've read, real like xenophobic, racist sentiment that she actually wants to outcompete the military on. Is not a case of, yeah. And I think that is something that maybe in this discussion of good guys and bad guys, I think that, you know, I don't think that there are good guys and bad guys in this situation. I think that there are just guys that are doing quite horrific things all around.
And she wouldn't be, and the point I guess I'm trying to make is she wouldn't be the first freedom fighter who gains power and then leads a politics that has a very strong seam of nationalism.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's I guess what we're trying to through. Listen, I'm gonna try and bring to a close, but I just wanted, before everyone logs off, just to sort of say, look, the thing about our open news meeting is it is supposed to do this. It's supposed to take some of the stories that are in front of us and think, how do we go after them, and also flag up stories we might be missing. With that in mind, I hope people can see, even in the first month of this year, how some things are developing. So we're really trying to emphasize in the slow newscast, in the weekly file, to take a story, to take a subject that itself is revealing. So if you look at Paul Caruana Galicia's reporting on Corinna and King Juan Carlos, it's actually a story about monarchy, it's a story about corruption, and it's a story about a certain complacency in the EU, a bizarre complacency, but it's hinged around a story. And I hope you'll see more and more of that there's something that is really a big story that's being told. I hope you saw that last week in Louise's reporting into hidden homicides, an attempt to try and thread through stories. So we've got that. At the same time, I don't know whether you've heard either in the app or on some of the other platforms like Spotify, we're doing daily SenseMaker. So as well as the daily SenseMaker email you get that tries to make sense of the world every day, in audio, we're doing something that we haven't seen anyone else do, which is we're doing a one story news bulletin. We take one story and we try and use it to explain a whole bunch about what's going on in the world. Please do take a listen, either because you come to this meeting on a Tuesday and you've got ideas for stories, or you've got ways that you think you might improve it. And then thirdly, we realize that we don't want to be in the snap opinion business, but we do think there's a place for a different kind of commentary and opinion, hence slow views. And we're trying to bring those together. You know, if you saw, you know, Matt Dancona's piece yesterday, it was a deep, long look at exactly the extent to which Brexit has really begun in earnest, and the way in which that changes the conception of what the nation can do and the way in politicians think about that. And today we're looking at government supply of information over the course of the past year. Slow views. Please do, again, if you've got thoughts, weigh in with those. I just wanted to keep everyone up to date with those, because if they've got ideas, please bring them to this meeting or to me or other colleagues at Tortoise. But for today, listen, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Stay safe, wash your hands, keep warm, and take good care of yourselves. All the best. Thanks.